So again, my name is Jason Cow from Fox Security. You're at SANS CloudSecNext 2025, and I'm here to talk to you, and you're here to learn about 19 years of Amazon S3, but cloud data security is still complex to manage. But before we start, first, I can't see everyone, but show of hands, who's used Amazon S3 before? Awesome, lots of hands. If you're in the virtual track, I can't see your hands, but thanks for participating. I'm assuming you also raise your hand. So who here actively tries to secure or uses security tools to secure S3? Awesome, a few less hands, but a lot of hands too. Great, so let's get started. Before we get started, let's talk about me and how my background suits this talk. So quick about me. This is me, I'm Jason Cow. Thanks. So now that you know about me, let's talk about what we're actually gonna learn today. We're gonna first start with the history of S3. It'll be kind of quick. We'll talk about the complexity of S3 and how it's complex to manage, especially access, security, et cetera, things like that. We'll then talk about managing the complexity of S3 and some key takeaways on how to manage that well. And lastly, we'll cover a conclusion and key takeaways, things to do, actionable insights we can actually approach and look at S3. So let's start with the history. Amazon S3, some of you may know this, was released in 2006. And again, these are not all the features of S3, but a few of them we picked out for this slide itself. 2010, it added management console functionality. 2011, static website hosting. 2018, block public access for S3. 2023, encrypts new objects by default, which is somewhat big. And then lastly, 2025, Amazon S3 celebrated their 19-year anniversary. So congratulations, Amazon S3. So from a growth perspective, in 2007, and again, sorry, the chart's a logarithmic chart, so it may not look to scale, but in 2007, it started with 10 billion items, and it's moved up to over 400 trillion objects as of 2025 using their news blog, exabytes of data, 150 million requests per second, as well as thousands of AWS customers store over 1 petabyte of data. So as you can see, Amazon S3 is not going away. Amazon S3 in 2025, this is a screenshot from the console just a few days ago. So you'll see things like general purpose buckets, which is mostly what we're gonna focus on today. There's also directory buckets, table buckets, vector buckets, and then other security tools such as access grants, access points. You'll see IAM Access Analyzer for S3 and other things here to help you manage that. But we're not necessarily here to talk about the history of S3 and what's happened over the years. We're here to talk about security and what has recently happened. As you can be aware, right, over the last few years, there have been different S3 attacks or different S3 incidents in the news. And these are just a few examples. In 2022, European airline left 6.5 terabytes worth of data in an unsecured S3 bucket. This included staff data, flight details, and more. These were a little bit more, the next two are a little bit more unique. In 2025, a firm called Watchtower reported 150 abandoned S3 buckets that could be used to attack governments, military networks, Fortune 100s, and more. So as you may be aware, resources in AWS typically have an account number in the Amazon Resource Identifier, which is called an ARN. For S3, that is not the case. So for example, if I'm trying to create a bucket called JSON bucket, you will not be able to create that bucket if it's already existing. So what Watchtower found was that for all these 150 buckets that were referenced in code bases, et cetera, things like that, these entities, these governments, military networks, Fortune 100s, no longer actually own the bucket or had that created, so it was deleted, and they could actually take over that bucket. I think that's also called bucket sniping, which is a different term to describe that security incident or security vulnerability. There's also in 2025 reported by Halcyon, Codefinger S3 ransomware, which we've heard about SSE-C encryption earlier today from one of our talks, but this is a unique ransomware attack that leverages SSE-C encryption. So this is a unique type of encryption that Amazon S3 has, where when you put an object or you write an object, you actually specify the KMS key, or the encryption key that you use to encrypt the data. Amazon will never hold that key. So in essence, if you don't have access to that key later, you are unable to decrypt that data. So we've talked a little bit about the history. We've talked a little bit about some of the security incidents recently. Let's talk about how S3 is complex. First, the thing I'd like to talk about is how there are layers of S3 configuration, right? So as you may be aware, Amazon's introduced new features throughout the years that we're going to talk about. At the base level, we have object level configuration. This is the data you store in S3. We have bucket level configuration, which is actually at the storage, the bucket level itself. We have account level, and we'll go to examples later. And then lastly, we have organization level. So as you can imagine, there are 4 different places where we can actually apply S3 security configuration other pieces to S3. A little bit of background on that. Again, 2006, Amazon S3 was released. 2011, IAM, Identity Access Management, goes GA. So in this case, they also released support for resource-based policies. As you may be aware, buckets may have bucket policies attached to those. So this is another way of access control to S3. 2017, AWS introduced organizations and service control policies. 2018, block public access at both the account and the bucket level. 2021, object ownership settings were introduced to disable ACLs. And then 2024, Amazon introduced resource control policies. As a lot, we'll cover some of this more in depth later. So now we talk about the different levels of controls. At the organization level, basically we can apply these to accounts, OUs, which are groups of accounts, or an organization. So all the accounts within your organization. Service control policies are a type of organizational policy using the IAM policy language that can be used to manage permissions in your account. Slightly different, and this was recent, resource control policies are a type of policy we can use to manage permissions for resources in the account itself. And again, these can apply to accounts, OUs, or organization, how you choose. We'll go down to account level controls. We have block public access. Again, you can apply this to your account and say, I want to override all my public ACLs and public policies, thus blocking public access to S3. And then we have bucket level controls. There's block public access. Again, same thing as account level, just at a bucket level, so more specific. Bucket policies, which control access. Object ownership, right? If I can enable or disable ACLs themselves, and then also server-side encryption, which is a default encryption if you don't specify something when you put or write data to S3. And lastly, object level controls. We have ACLs, server-side encryption. Again, you can set this at the object level and actually override the bucket level ones, then object lock. And while this requires enablement at the bucket level, it can be used to prevent objects from being deleted or overwritten. So before we move on, we've talked about the complexity, and what better way to look at complexity by looking at security tooling and how it actually detects S3 and how it analyzes your S3 security posture. So earlier this year, we actually presented this at a different conference, Forward CloudSec. I see some familiar faces in here in Berlin, Germany. But we found a flaw with one of Amazon's security and government services. This service is called Trusted Advisor, and a little bit of background. It's closely tied to your support plan and in AWS for your account. But keep in mind, right, all AWS accounts, so every single one, comes with the Trusted Advisor S3 security check. So what we have here, a couple news sources talking about the flaw that we found, as well as the original blog itself. So what we found was that there were 3 distinct scenarios where Trusted Advisor's alerting could be bypassed and would not alert on public buckets. That included the creation of a bucket policy that blocked Trusted Advisor from at least one of the following 3 actions. So again, tied to the IAM policy language. We found that if we blocked Trusted Advisor from S3 get bucket ACL, we blocked it from get bucket policy status, and also from get bucket public access block. That would actually mark, or Trusted Advisor would mark the bucket as secure and ignore it, which would not alert properly. We reported this to the Amazon Vulnerability Disclosure team. They're fantastic to work with. But over about a month and a half, this issue was fully remediated. So as of July 2025, this issue is no longer usable. So we've talked a lot about the background. We've talked about how it's complex and how even some security tooling found it complex as well. So let's talk about how to manage the complexity. At the last conference I was at, one of my friends actually mentioned this in his talk, and I found it very insightful, right? So at a high level, we want to look at how do we make the right thing easy to do and exceptions possible to handle. And how do we do that? We create preventative guardrails with data perimeters. We'll talk about some examples there later. We streamline access controls in S3 and define patterns. And for example, we want to retire, we think about retiring the usage of ACLs and focus on just using something like bucket policies or IAM. We look at ensuring detective controls scan properly for all S3 configuration items. We also look at applying controls as appropriate across all 4 levels: organization, account, bucket, and object. And as you can imagine, right, tracking some of these gets difficult at different levels, and visibility is very important across all 4 levels. So from a preventive guardrail perspective, we see these as a couple different pieces. We see resource control policies, service control policies at the organization level. We see account public access block at the account level, and we see bucket public access block and object ownership at the bucket level itself. So these are diagrams that we did in research on how to use SCPs and RCPs when RCPs were first released. I'm a huge fan of Venn diagrams. So what we have is resource control policies. restrict access to resources within your organization. Service control policies restrict access to principals within your organization. And the combination of them restricts access to resources within your organization from principals within your organization. But at a high level, we have this chart, right? So if you're looking at resources within your organization, and again, right, whether you're looking at resources outside the organization, the top chart will show you which organizational level control to use. Now, keep in mind here that RCPs do not have support for all AWS services. It has a limited set, and some of that includes S3 and KMS as well, which is very useful creating data perimeters. So we talked about data perimeters. Let's look at one of these examples. So this is one of the examples we came up with to prevent SSEC ransomware. You'll also see, I think Amazon also came up with a blog on this as well, because it became, I think, a little bit more pressing earlier this year. So what we do is we deny put object with this condition key, and this will actually block anyone from putting objects with SSCE encryption. The next example I'll give is not a complete policy because it didn't quite fit in the screen. The full example is available in our GitHub. But another thing is you can prevent S3 public access, and not just using block public access. We can actually block this anyone from outside of organizations or a collection of accounts by using this condition key. Keep in mind, right, using the principle as AWS service is really important here, so it doesn't break AWS services actually doing things on your behalf. And the other statement that's missing in the ellipses down there is a confused deputy statement that blocks confused deputy in this case. Other people using AWS services maliciously and tricking AWS to do things on their behalf. So from a resource perspective, this is a chart that Amazon created. I really like it. It shows identity, resource, network, and how to use different controls. And I think IAM policy language here, so different conditions on how to create the data perimeter. One thing to note here is you see a new condition key is released a couple months, actually either a month or a few weeks ago. VPC org ID, VPC account, VPC org paths. These are all important controls that help control from a network perspective. And these were new releases at ABOS. I think actually no, their VPC account or something like that. Can't remember exactly, but Amazon has been improving their data perimeter as well as some of the controls there. Amazon Samples has a great repository of data perimeters, and then some of the ones that we reference are also below in our fog security repo there. So moving on, let's talk about block public access. This is more than one setting. It's actually 4 settings. So it basically blocks access through new ACLs, any existing ACLs, new public bucket policies, or also any existing bucket policies there. So one of the things we recommend, right, is to turn this on the account level wherever possible. If you have exception accounts or exception buckets, right, then we recommend turning them on wherever you can. And then lastly, right, looking at retiring ACLs from an object ownership perspective. This is a little bit trickier because object ownership does not sound like it's related to ACLs, but actually if you set object ownership, in this case to bucket owner enforce, it actually will disable ACLs across the board, both at the bucket and the object level. If you're trying to do this, keep in mind that tracking object ACLs is a little bit more complex to do. So keep in mind when you're looking through exactly if you can retire ACLs or not. So we've talked a lot about the preventive controls. There's over 10 different security settings that we see from a configuration perspective. And keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list, right? We talked about ACLs, we talked about policies, BPA, which is block public access, object ownership controls. There's also different types of logging, right, from a detection perspective. And just so you're aware, right, not all S3 actions will naturally occur in CloudTrail. There's CloudTrail management account or CloudTrail management events, which are most of like the S3 control items, things that you do on the bucket operations, things like that. But data events are not by default logged, so you can turn that on. The other thing is you can actually turn on server access logging, which is a different type of logging for object level calls. And some certain calls may look different across server access logging and also S3 data events there too. So from a public perspective, how do we evaluate access and look at that, right? So from access control list, there's actually 5 different things we have to look at, right? Is the ACLs enabled for the bucket, public ACLs, we look at the account block public access and the bucket block public access, as well as resource control policies. We can argue that we can look at KMS and encryption there as well, but we'll just focus on S3 here. For a bucket policy, we have the bucket policy itself, account block public access, the bucket block public access, and also resource control policies. So as you can see, S3 access can be complex to look at and manage. So now that we've talked a lot about some of the security pieces, let's talk and go through some of the actionable items from here. So S3 is a fantastic service, a lot of new features coming out, a lot of very powerful features. We see it as with great power comes great responsibility and how to leverage these features and how to use them properly. We recommend shifting left, setting guardrails and understand patterns. We also recommend secure by default settings where applicable. And lastly, we recommend understanding your S3 security settings and making sure your security tooling understands them too. If you're an organization that uses a CSPM or paid security tooling, right? A lot of great tools out there. We want to make sure that they actually report errors properly. There's a lot of great open source tools as well. And then we've also developed a very opinionated S3 scanner that's open source called Yes3 Scanner, and feel free to check that out. Lastly, here's our resources, right? Talked about the open source scanner. We talked about data perimeters. And just so you're aware, the QR code does not lead you to some random website. That leads you to my LinkedIn if you'd like to get in contact with me and have a conversation about anything related to cloud security. Thanks for your time, everyone.